Hey everybody, welcome to the live stream on the Johnny podcast. I forget what this is called. This is just a live stream I'm doing randomly because I want to source my audience for ideas. I want to take you behind the scenes a little bit and show you how I prepare for these videos, these researches that I do. And I'm going to be preparing for the video anyway. And it's kind of boring to do by myself sometimes, not all the time. And it just occurred to me that, since I'm getting a little bit mentally stuck with hitting a wall, that maybe I should bring the audience in and have you guys chat with me. I've already got some lurkers, so I'm pretty good. I guess I'll start out. I have this little bit of music playing in the background because StreamYard gives you these little background musics. I don't know if you can hear them, but it's kind of nice. Don't know if that just goes on forever or not, but kind of fade out. Okay. Yeah. Well, I just don't want it to go over the entire thing. All right. So first of all, so that you all know just how much of an obsessive person I am, I'm going to show you all the books that I checked out of the library about William McKinley. And I will tell you this much. When you watch some video on YouTube from some creator who has millions of subscribers and does 7 videos a day and does one video on I have one video on William McKinley. He did not read this many books, or she did not read these many books about William McKinley before doing their video. With me, you can always be guaranteed I will do the research required to get you something interesting. So, all right, let's go through these books one title at a time. First of all, this is just a short book about William McKinley's brief before presidency life, a brief part about how he became president and his biography, and then just his presidency. This is part of a larger series, and it's by Kevin Phillips. It's called, let's see, I think it's just called William McKinley. Then I have this old ass book. This one's kind of interesting. I think it's from, let's see when it's from. Oh, okay. It's called the McKinley and Roosevelt Administrations. And so that's one of the interesting things about William McKinley. There he is. This is the guy right here, William McKinley. He's got a good presidential look, I gotta say. I think he's a star. So this is one of those classic old books, copyright 1922, University of Texas Library. So, and it's just one of these books where they don't even have chapters. They just have first I talk about this, then I talk about that. First I talk about Mark Hanna. And then on page 12, it's Mark Hanna, and it doesn't even have a chapter head. You just keep reading, and on page 12, he just starts talking about Mark Hanna, success, McKinley's nomination. These kinds of books I have a soft spot for. Also because the contents are great. Because if you're let's say you have a project, I had to do a project on William McKinley and the annexation of Hawaii. So I just got this book out, and I looked for the chap, where does he write about Hawaii? And then you can just go to the page and read that part. You don't have to read the whole book. So that's an interesting one. Then I got this one, the American Empire Building. So when we're talking about McKinley, we're talking about the transition from the United States as let's just say one of a bunch of countries on the world stage that was probably more famous than a lot of countries, just because we had redefined the whole idea of nationhood with the American Revolution, but our country was still pretty marginal. We were mostly known for, uh, you know, our farms and all the raw materials and stuff, the mining that we were able to trade with other countries in Europe and places like that. Glad someone is finally making a video about William McKinley. Really, nobody's talking about William McKinley. He's a really important president. Really important president. Maybe the one of the most important presidents, at least in terms of the world you live in, for better or for worse. So William McKinley is sort of, I made a video about this before, credited with bringing us into the period where America became an empire. There's also another book which I couldn't find in my library, unfortunately, called How to Hide an Empire. It's a more current book. And it talks about how we never really officially became an empire, but we figured out a way to do it on our own terms. And this is where the debate comes in about whether McKinley really did create an empire or if he created like a new system that isn't empire, or he updated empire so that it was ready for the industrial age, ready for the global age. Because one of the things about William McKinley in the United States is that, well, one of the things about the United States, I would say, and American imperialism is that it, in many ways, represents a genuine attempt to like solve the problem of imperialism by offering an alternate way in which, with a country like the United States sort of as the hegemon, as the most sort of like as the country overseeing everything, we could still like preserve maximal freedom for the rest of the world and let countries sort of thrive and pursue happiness within their own boundaries, but with the United States sort of like overseeing it all benevolently. And William McKinley's personality really fits with that vision of the United States, I found in my reading, because he genuinely comes across as like a moral human being in his personal life and a good Christian man, a man who even prays before he makes his big decisions. So a man who takes care of his sickly wife, waits on her hand and foot, even while he's president of the United States. His wife was what was called an invalid in those days, but she had some kind of epilepsy or something like that. And then everyone said that the way he cared for her was like saintly. He was also an incredibly brave soldier in the Civil War. He was a labor attorney. He was like, in his heart, seemingly a good man, which is perfect for this idea of a benevolent emperor. It just the personality profile is perfect for this image of the United States having a benevolent empire. Yeah. Let's see. Jacob Ayers. William McKinley also finally ended Spain's imperial holdings in America, which led to Spain's even further decline, which eventually culminated in the Spanish Civil War. Yes. A lot of these civil wars and they can happen when when an empire has sort of overstretched itself and is in decline, and people are remembering in their hearts the days when we were great, but looking around them and seeing that everything has declined. And you can understand why the Spanish would feel that way, because, in America, there's nobody going to get elected president on a platform of decline. Ronald Reagan was the famous one who, Jimmy Carter had said things like, we need to manage expectations and we need to cut down on consumerism. And then Ronald Reagan came out and said, Jimmy Carter wants us to have smaller slices of the economy, but we want the whole pie, and he crushed Carter. So, yes, William McKinley was a devout Methodist. Yeah. No, he was honestly like the funny thing is, and I'm reading a lot of problem with presidential biographies is they are often hagiographies. And so the authors often present the best sides of them. And even when they present their foibles or their negative traits, they're like, but it was in service of their greatness. But I don't have any reason to contradict the narrative that William McKinley was like a good man in his personal life. He joined the Union Army out of a conviction to free the slaves, which is not why everybody joined the Union Army. And it's not why the United States was in the fight until Lincoln sort of realigned the war aims with the Emancipation Proclamation and endorsed this idea that they were fighting against slavery. But William McKinley was convicted to fight against slavery from the start. And he had a very strong heart for the workers as well, from what I understand. Okay, but you can be a good guy once you become president. Doesn't mean you're going to do a good job. So we'll see what. And sometimes being a good guy is actually not good because, I don't know, the presidency can change people. All right, but we'll see how McKinley fares. So yeah, this book, The American Empire Building. This isn't really about McKinley per se, but it has essays by Noam Chomsky, talks about the Gulf War a lot, the New World Order under George H.W. Bush. I would say George H.W. Bush is probably a disciple of McKinley in a lot of ways. I mean, the Gulf War is very similar to the Spanish-American War in that it was a war with a clear aim that was achieved quickly and with a decisive victory. And you could argue that the Gulf War presaged the second invasion of Iraq, which was a debacle. And the Spanish-American War presaged the Philippines War because we got the Philippines in the settlement with Spain. And that was also a debacle. But William McKinley died before it became a debacle. That was left to Theodore Roosevelt to handle. And then William Taft and Wilson and all the way up until 1945, I think, when the Philippines became an independent country, or 46, after World War II. All right. What else we got here? Oh, this is my favorite one because it's got a great title. And I'm going to sing it to you. From the front porch to the front page, McKinley Bryan 96 campaign by William D. Harpine. If you didn't recognize it, that was Thunder Road by Bruce Springsteen. This is all about the transformative 1896 campaign, which if you've never read about the 1896 presidential campaign, holy cow, that was a huge one. That alone makes William McKinley transformative. We will get into that along the way. Let's see here. Kind of crazy that McKinley's commanding officer in the Union Army was Rutherford B. Hayes. I feel like that's the only time that happened other than George Washington and James Monroe. I also read recently that McKinley was serving under Rutherford B. Hayes in 1864 during the election of 1864, and that both Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley voted at the same polling station at the same time for Abraham Lincoln in that election, as they were out in the field. And so, the polling stations would be set up at the military camps. Kind of an unfair advantage for Lincoln there, because he would just go to all. But I guess the soldiers could have voted against Lincoln. They could have said, we're sick of this war. But they supported him, which is part of why he's considered a great president. But another important thing is that he didn't just serve under Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes was William McKinley's coach, his mentor, his political advisor. He advised McKinley to run for Congress in 1876, the same year that he became president of the United States. So they entered national politics at the same time. And McKinley became a superstar in Congress. He was there for a long time, eventually became a senator, and he was responsible for the McKinley tariff, which was passed. And you have to give him at least credit for his legislative skills and the fact that he was able to pass a tariff under the Grover Cleveland administration. So Grover Cleveland was like the last guy to ever want tariffs, and he actually managed to go over Cleveland's head and pass the tariff. Now we can get into the effects of the tariff because it's largely considered by most of the books I read to have been a big failure, although some of the authors I've read blame big business in terms of, like, in those days you had the trusts, and so the trusts were conspiring to subvert the tariff by purposefully raising prices, basically to convince the American people that the tariffs were inflating the prices of goods, but they were really working together in trusts and conspiring to do that. That's part of the reason why the Republicans under McKinley and Roosevelt and Taft became such avid trust busters, because they saw the interests of businesses conspiring to sort of subvert the will of the people. Let's see. It's kind of an understated fact that both McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, his two-time opponent in both elections, were very devout Christians. They probably would have been good friends if not for politics. Yeah. So the William Jennings Bryan is known for the Scopes monkey trial, in which he, I don't want to tell the story wrong, but the Inherit the Wind is based on it, and it's something to do with him defending the idea of creationism. Maybe somebody in the comments can elaborate on that. Yeah. Oh yeah. Also, wonder who George McClellan voted for himself. Or maybe he thought, maybe he voted for Lincoln because he thought the Civil War is such a SHIT show that I don't want to be president, and he thought Lincoln would fail. So I don't know. But no way. McClellan's ego could never he would never vote for Lincoln. Okay, so the campaign of 1896 is notable for two fundamental reasons. The first reason is that both candidates ran completely different strategies, totally unrelated strategies. One guy ran, it's a pure example of, like, does this work or does that work? Let's run a test. You do this, I'll do that, and we'll see which one works. So there was nothing in common between the two strategies. Like, for example, okay, if you're going to run against Donald Trump, you're going to hold rallies because Donald Trump holds rallies, right? And you need to compete with him on the rallies. Well, imagine there was a candidate who ran against Donald Trump and said, I'm not going to beat him at rallies. He's the master of rallies. There's no way I'm going to win. So I'm going to run a fundamentally different strategy from what he would do. And that's how I'll beat him. Now, interestingly, in the 2020 election, in a sense, this is exactly what Joe Biden did. He ran what was later called the basement campaign. He made very few public appearances and mostly campaigned through the internet on videos and things like that. As it turned out, this heavily advantaged him because of the pandemic. We may not remember this from 2020, but one of the big disadvantages for Trump in that election was that he was unable to hold rallies, and that was one of his biggest ways of promoting his campaigns. Not just because of all the people who would come to see him, but because of the projection of this huge event into the internet for people to watch online. And then the clips that were mined from these events, whether they were crazy things he said or things that his supporters would get behind, these things are repackaged and sent out to the world. Now, William Jennings Bryan ran all over the country. He ran all over the country. His campaign strategy was what later became known as the Whistle Stop Tour. So this is the first campaign in which the railroads are in such as are there are such how do I put this? There are so many railroads and they're so accessible, and travel by rail is so convenient by this year that William Jennings Bryan gets this idea of, I'm going to take trains all around the country and I'm going to visit everywhere. I'm going to visit every town and state all across the country I possibly can. I'm going to give huge speeches and rallies. So this is similar to the Trump strategy, right? So he's getting out there and he's making a big show. And his campaign really did take the country by storm. Bryan didn't ultimately win, but his campaign was transformative, and many other future candidates would embrace similar strategies and win. It's just that Bryan wasn't able to pull it off in 1896. Now, Bryan would give these impassioned speeches. In fact, one of them was called the Cross of Gold speech, in which he would get out there and say, the Republicans want to hang our country on a cross of gold. What does that mean? Well, the big issue in the election of 1896, and it was a big issue for a long time, was the idea of the gold standard. Okay, so you have paper money backed by gold. So if you give a bill to somebody, that bill represents gold somewhere in a gold reserve. However, there were a few reasons why people were starting to say, maybe we should do something other than the gold standard. Number one, gold is a very rare and precious metal. And so if you don't have enough gold, you can't print enough money. And so if, let's say the excitement and vigor of the people to build and industrialize and grow and start their own businesses is so overwhelming that there's not enough gold available to fund everyone and make sure that these things grow. And at this time, the country, if you look at the statistics, industrialization, farming, exports, imports, every stat is growing and growing. Population, it's all getting bigger and bigger. So you need some kind of liquidity to help get everybody out there and to start their businesses and their farms, and their factories and everything as quickly as possible, so the country can flourish. However, if you make the currency too cheap, if you back the currency with some other metal than gold, you get that liquidity, but you also risk devaluing your currency and making to the point where you're giving out money, tons of paper, but that paper is not worth anything. And so it can cause economic stagnation. Let's see. I wish our politics were centered around wonky policy fights like the gold standard or the greenbacks. Yeah, I see what you say about wonky policy fights like the gold standard, because I don't know if I don't think that the genie can be put back in the bottle with the gold standard at this point. But McKinley was very strongly supportive of the gold standard. Now, what's interesting is McKinley's a Republican, Bryan is a Democrat. The only Democrat who had been in office since the Civil War was Grover Cleveland. And Grover Cleveland was also for the gold standard. So silver people were really kind of screwed for a long time. And William Jennings Bryan was like the Bernie Sanders of the silver. You know, he was like the guy who was like, I'm going to do it. You know how Bernie's like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to get everybody health care. Well, Bryan was like, I'm going to finally do it. I'm going to finally get us silver so that we can have liquidity so that we can have more money, and so that especially our farmers who, operate on debt, can have a quicker way to pay off their debts and stuff like that, right? So this is a policy that appeals to the farmers, and it is presented by Brian in an emotional and personal and like almost humanitarian way, similar to Bernie Sanders again. And in the terms of like Christianity, right? They're hanging us on a cross of gold. Um, you know, Bernie had this as well with the healthcare debate, right? They want to deny us healthcare. Healthcare is a human right. Right? The right to have silver is a human right. And so Brian is crossing the country spreading this message of silver. And William McKinley is sticking to the old gold standard. Now, that's a huge problem for McKinley because this new silver idea with this powerful champion in Brian is really exciting a lot of people. So I'm going to get to William McKinley's campaign in a second, but I got another question about the silver standard. Silver standard would have been disastrous, in my opinion. The Republic of China was one of the only countries to ever use it, and it was a disaster. So McKinley ultimately does go in on bimetallism. And obviously we do have silver in our currency. I mean, we have nickels and things like that. Although now they're made of, now the amount, this is why I say the gold standard cat out of the bag or whatever, because even the coins we use now, the mix of metals that they have, zinc and whatever, nothing is pure anymore. Yes, but McKinley was for the gold standard, although later he did capitulate to bimetallism and allow silver to get in. So his whole thing was at first to be pro-gold, but then later he sort of evolved on this and said, okay, clearly we can't just hold to the rigid gold standard. It's clear that just the gold standard itself is very rigid. And you do need some flexibility in an economy, especially when growing like the United States at that time. So I think bimetallism was probably a necessary sort of evil. But Brian, he puts this in this emotional sort of terms that like it must be silver. So this also helps a lot of people vote for McKinley because the emotional appeals of Brian also sort of stir up this sense that he's a radical. And so more conservative voters are actually quite afraid, similar to the way that people would be afraid if Bernie was close to winning the presidency. A lot of voters in the United States were afraid of letting that crazy William Jennings Bryan in there. I think he was super young too. He was like 38. So yeah. Okay. So McKinley, this is one of the moments that a lot of his biographers highlight as proof that he was a really smart and even humble in a lot of ways guy. So Brian's crossing the country, making these big speeches, holding these huge rallies. It's like almost like the Beatles. And so they come to McKinley and they say, you're going to have to go out there and you're going to have to hold rallies. What are you going to do? You can't just let this guy go crossing all over the country. And McKinley says, bro, I cannot compete with William Jennings Bryan. If the game is who can hold the most rallies and get the most attention, that's not a game I'm going to win. So I'm going to play a totally different game. I'm going to run a front porch campaign. Now, that was not a new idea. Other presidents had run the front porch campaign. Benjamin Harrison had run the front porch campaign. And what the front porch campaign is when you campaign without leaving your house. You don't leave your home. You sit out on your front porch You give speeches, you greet delegations, your speeches are published in the newspapers. That's it. And the reason why that was such a brilliant move is that in those days, okay, earlier I talked about the railroads and how improvements in transportation had allowed Bryan to run this cross-country campaign, this innovative new campaign. But there were also improvements in media communication, in the spread of information, such that one didn't necessarily need to go to California in order to have one's words be heard in California. It was almost like the age of television. And McKinley was the first person, the first presidential candidate to really understand this new, the power of this new medium of media, that he didn't really need to go anywhere as long as he was pushing out information constantly. And so McKinley assembled an entire, what you would call now kind of like a public relations committee, a group of people whose job it was to sort of handle the media, make sure that the right reporters came at the right time to see McKinley give the speech. Then they would send out talking points to, or clips from William McKinley's speeches that contained talking points. So William McKinley would say all this stuff, and they would pick out the part that contained the important talking point. They'd send that to every single newspaper all around the country, and then all these countries would print the same talking point. And so McKinley had this like incredible message discipline that everyone in the country heard what McKinley had to say without having to physically see him. Now, that being said, a lot of people did physically see him, because when you do the front porch campaign, you don't just stand out there on the porch by yourself and talk to an empty field. People come to visit you. And believe it or not, people came in droves to see William McKinley. Delegations of all kinds, veterans groups, interest groups, like school trip. Okay, everybody, we're going to, I think it was Canton, Ohio. Okay, everybody, we're going to Canton for a school trip, and we're going to watch the presidential candidate give a speech. And they would have bands, and they would broadcast on radio. And even it created really the same celebratory environment that Bryan had created with his rallies, with the notable difference being that while Bryan was kind of running around and sweating and kind of like lowering himself to like a kind of P.T. Barnum style campaign, almost like the traveling circus, William McKinley appeared much more stately by contrast, as he was sort of, above the fray. Now, some voters wouldn't vote for him because that would come across as elitist, but he made the gambit that more voters would see Bryan as the circus master, the P.T. Barnum character, and McKinley as the statesman. And that's ultimately what happened. McKinley ended up pulling off the victory. It was a close race, but he did win a decisive victory in 1896 and became the president of the United States. So I want to do a couple of videos about McKinley in some upcoming series. I think I'd like to do a video about the 1896 election, in which I talk about all of those kinds of ways that this election was transformative. And then I want to talk about his presidency. So I don't know, what kind of ideas do you guys have in terms of what would be an interesting angle to take in talking about William McKinley and his presidency? I'll wait for questions, but okay. This is another book, The Presidency of William McKinley by Lewis Gould. This is like the hagiography, like the pro McKinley case, the case for McKinley as the great president, or as actually most historians call him, a near great president. The reason being that he didn't live to finish his second term, and Theodore Roosevelt overshadowed him. So yeah, let's see what else we got. Yeah, Realigning America. So these books are often about the transformative nature of the McKinley presidency. And of course, finally, you got to have the Robert W. Mary book. He also has a great one on James K. Polk, which I recommend highly. It's called A Country of Vast Design. And I like Robert W. Mary because he has the right historian's critical stance on manifest destiny and imperialism without going so far into the like preachy, like basically like the kind of historians who criticize the United States for everything, like as if countries can't make any decisions in their own interests without being horrible. Just like the Howard Zinn, mentality, which I find to be more based on emotional, like this emotional desire to make yourself feel better about the tough things, the tough decisions your country had to make. I don't know. Maybe I sound too much like a patriot, but I don't mind being called a patriot. I am a patriot. What can I say? Take that under advisement when you listen to me. I love doing this. I love doing this kind of like history discussion stuff, but I hate the part of it that's kind of like where you have to be an influencer, and then people sort of like in the comments sometimes people are like, "You're bad for the opinion you had" or something. You know what I mean? And you're just like, but no one should just listen to me. They should have their own opinion and do their own research. Anyway. I forgot there's one more. And obviously if I'm gonna make videos about McKinley, I have to talk about Leon Czolgosz and the assassination. This is the man who shot McKinley. And usually the story of McKinley's assassination is presented as a sort of outpouring of assassination culture and anarchism, which actually would be, there was an article today about assassination culture somewhere in relation to the Trump administration. Let's see if I can find it. It's Fox News, yeah. New bombshell study reveals assassination. Yeah. Oh, this is going to be fun. I'll wait for if you have any questions about what we can leave, please.
Times. The killer smiles and the internet applauds. The murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson exposed a dangerous shift in societal norms. What was once extreme rhetoric confined to the fringes of the internet has now exploded into murderous action that is being publicly celebrated. But how did this happen? The NCRI has uncovered a growing permission structure that justifies violence through a cycle of amplification and reinforcement. They term it assassination culture, and it's growing on the far left. Social media platforms provide the stage, while viral memes and online communities provide justification. The result, a cultural shift that lowers moral boundaries for targeted violence. Those shouting their approval are no longer fringe extremists. These narratives are spreading on every major platform, while law enforcement investigators assigned to the case have been swarmed with abuse online. Even employees at the McDonald's where Mangione was apprehended have been relentlessly harassed for ratting him out. The lionization of Luigi Mangione, the man arrested for Thompson's murder, has created a wave of copycat threats. On December 17, 2024, a newly hired employee stabbed the company president in a meeting and smiled in his police photo, taking clear inspiration from Mangione's online persona, while other fans have called for the death of Elon Musk and other prominent CEOs. In a survey, the NCRI found that nearly 40% of respondents thought that burning Teslas was at least somewhat acceptable, and over a third said the same about killing Elon Musk. Over 50% of those self-identifying as left of center thought it was at least somewhat justified to kill Donald Trump. These attitudes correlate closely with blue sky use and support for Mangione. For Mangione, supporters have raised over $400,000 online for his legal defense and are actively attempting to sway the jury towards nullification. But why are people supporting Mangione? Research reveals that 3 key factors predict support: authoritarian tendencies, a perceived loss of personal control, and heavy social media use. Survey results show that at least 44% of Americans believe that Thompson's murder was at least somewhat justified, and among heavy social media users, that number is even higher. Blue Sky, the so-called safe space Twitter, has seen the most alarming trends. At least 78% of users express some level of support for the killing. Institutional trust has eroded, and anti-establishment rhetoric is at an all-time high. Hashtags like Eat the Rich saw approximately 400% swings, not only after the assassination carried out by Mangione, but after the attempted assassination of President Trump. The normalization of violence is no longer hypothetical. It's here on our streets and in our homes. The response to Mangione online has been a viral spectacle that tells a romantic but completely false narrative. A public killing is not justice. It is a rejection of the very principles that uphold our civilization. The real question isn't who Mangione is. The real question is, who are we?
Whoa. Whew. Well, there's 2 things I could say about that. Number one is, in reference to McKinley. That might be an interesting topic for a video to talk about assassination culture in terms of, like Luigi and all that stuff, compared to Leon Czolgosz and the assassination culture of that time, because you had, what was her name? Anne something, the anarchist. I don't remember her name. What's her name? The anarchist lady. She's Russian, I think, in like the late 19th century, early 20th century. Not Emma Gold. No, Emma Goldman. Yeah, it's like Red Emmas. I always remember in Baltimore, Red Emmas. Emma Goldman. Is that right? Emma Goldman? Or am I thinking of somebody else? There's like 2 anarchist communists that not Ayn Rand. She was an objectivist. She was pro-capitalism. I'm talking about, okay, thank you, Randis. It is, but I am thinking of Emma Goldman in this case. But yes, the other person I confuse her with is Rosa Luxemburg. So Emma Goldman and her husband tried to attack their boss, or not their boss. That was from the video we just watched. Tried to attack and kill some industrialist, some businessman, factory owner. And there was this fear of assassination at the time, justified fear of assassination, because there was a lot of assassinations taking place. And, McKinley, what's interesting about McKinley is that in this transformational period, right? So you have William Jennings Bryan, who has this very emotional campaign, right? In which his policies are sort of, he's not saying that, well, Mr. McKinley has his policies and I have my policies, and we'll let the American people decide, and may the best man win. It's, if you elect McKinley, they will hang our country on a cross of gold. So it's raising the stakes here. It's a era, it's a period of time when people are really concerned about sort of the takeover of what would be the billionaires, the oligarchs, the industrialists, the trusts, right? And here you have McKinley, who came into office saying no wars of conquest, who said that he was for the working man, and then he's doing all these wars of conquest, and he's doing what the anarchists call imperialism, and so he becomes, a target for them. And so the idea is that the reason William McKinley died was not just because this one guy went and shot William McKinley, but because there was a culture of violence that was growing, that was prevalent in that period of time, that late 19th century, early 20th century period of time, from the left, that I can name a few examples. A.G. Palmer, Woodrow Wilson's attorney general, was bombed, although he survived, and that led to the first Red Scare, actually. The assassination of William McKinley. There's a lot from Europe, I remember. And Emma Goldman's attack. There was this, bombs, things like that. This kind of terrorism. And so you could argue that William McKinley was killed by assassination culture. And now there's the supporters of Donald Trump, or let's say supporters of Donald Trump and independents who are strongly against the use of violence, let's say, or moderates, right, are concerned about the temperature of the left. And according to that video, it's sort of blaming the assassination culture on three things. One of them is the sense of powerlessness. The second thing is constant internet use. And the third thing was the seeing other people do it, copycat. So we'll see. I have to be honest with you. I would say that I wonder and worry that there could be an attack on somebody in the administration. I think that Trump is probably going to be okay. I think there's sort of like if there's anyone out there who is like thinking about doing something violent, right? They're probably. I don't know. I just have a feeling like the next target would be somebody in the cabinet or in the administration, because the idea would be, let's scare him into like backing off or something like that. So I do think that that's a possibility. And, Trump is, for better or worse, a transformative president, and he's just completely transforming everything. We're entering into a new era, much like we were under William McKinley. So yeah, it's a similar period in that regard. I wonder if, it's interesting. Trump claims he's very superstitious. Trump claims he's superstitious. I wonder if if it never struck him that, like, I probably should be superstitious about comparing myself so much to a president who was assassinated. But if I were president, I would probably try to compare myself to like Washington or like FDR, unless I was on my fourth term. Maybe not one of the ones that was assassinated, but that's just me. Because I'm superstitious. So yeah, I have a video prepared about the tariff. So I was going to talk about maybe the tariffs. I'm sort of like, right now, I would say, as far as Trump's tariffs go, I am, let's say, concerned but agnostic about whether or not this is a good or bad idea. Because you always have to ask yourself, with every new Trump, hysteria that takes place, is this really going to stick, or is the media going to move on to something different in a couple of days? Signalgate is a great example. I think Signalgate is going to continue for a little while, but the media has seemed to pretty much move on from it. So, I think some of the people in Congress, maybe we'll get a little headline here or there, but that seems to be over and done with. Obviously, tariffs is going to be something. See, I remember the first year the first term when Trump announced tariffs, and it was a big to do. They weren't as comprehensive as these, but people were outraged and annoyed, but it seemed not to become one of the dominant themes of like criticism for the Trump administration, especially after Biden continued the tariffs that Trump had put in place. Sort of came across as an endorsement, right? So, so I think Trump's goal with the tariffs is way different than McKinley's. That's the big takeaway. Wait, let me say that over again. It's not way different than McKinley's. It's that the situation is much different. The problem that they're trying to fix is different. So Trump with his tariffs is trying to fix the problem of trade imbalances with other countries. He wants the United States to stop buying so much from other countries, and he wants those countries to buy from us. And the idea is that that means more people will get employed, there'll be more jobs, and there'll be more industry in the country. And honestly, that is a goal that, supposedly people like me who supported Bernie Sanders are aligned with. The question is whether tariffs are going to achieve that goal. Now, if they do, it's going to be hard to say, assuming Trump leaves peacefully in 4 years, that he was that bad of a president, because that will be a huge plus for the United States. In my opinion, McKinley's tariffs were also a huge plus for the United States. Not because tariffs are always the right answer, though, but because tariffs were the right answer at that time. And the reason I say this is that this was the key moment for American industry to become a major player. And I do think that you needed some amount of protectionism at that time to help incentivize in-house sort of production. In fact, interestingly, there's an economist here at my university named James Galbraith. He's actually the son of John Galbraith, who was in the Kennedy administration. And James Galbraith believes that when the United States blockaded effectively the Russian economy after the invasion of Ukraine, that they actually gave the Russians an excuse to start not industrializing, but to start doing things in-house instead of having the United States provide certain services, right? So like McDonald's, right? So you have McDonald's in Russia, so a lot of that money is going out of the country. Well, once they kicked McDonald's out and they created their own McDonald's, and now it's all done in-house. So the idea was that the sanctions against Russia was like us imposing protectionism on Russia, and that the Russian economy improved as a result of it. That's James Galbraith. So similarly, protectionism in the United States, if it does result in the creation of, a recreation of an industrial base in the country, that does lead to jobs and workers getting better wages and better jobs, that would be great. The problem, of course, is that we don't know what the condition and the situation is going to be for the workers, and we don't know what the condition and the situation is going to be for the owners. So that's always going to be we got to turn to old Karl Marx for information on that. Yeah. So from what I've read about the tariff, I would say that McKinley's tariff was good for American industry. It was good for workers, and it ensured that the United States was prepared to become the industrial powerhouse that it eventually became. So by the time the First World War rolls along and Germany and Britain and France are like, make us stuff, make us weapons, make us textiles, the industrial base was ready to crank that shit out because of, in large part, McKinley's policies on the tariff. And his sound money policy ensured the integrity of the US dollar. He presided over the improvement of the economy in the United States. These are all arguments in favor of William McKinley, and why I tend to agree that he is a near great president. Of course, the elephant in the room is imperialism, right? He said he was not going to start any new wars. No. He said he was not going to do any wars of conquest. But I have an argument, a counter argument to the idea that William McKinley did wars of conquest. So, and I'm only arguing for devil's advocate's sake, but part of me is swayed by this argument. And it is this. The McKinley administration, like all administrations, was focused on domestic policy. However, the world called. Cuba, which is only 90 miles off the coast of the United States and home to many sugar plantations owned by American businessmen, was in the middle of a brutal civil war between rebels who wanted a free Cuba, locals, and the Spanish Empire. And the Spanish Empire was rounding up the rebels and bringing them into reconcentrados, which are considered the first concentration camps. Or at least these were formative concentration camps that influenced the adoption of this practice, the idea of rounding up everybody and putting them in one place. And the idea that this one place is usually not healthy and that they die there or starve or get sick. And so McKinley, has a humanitarian cause. The Spanish are going bankrupt and they really need to go. And he tries to negotiate with Spain, despite the fact that the whole country is pushing him towards war. And then finally, he sends this submarine or warship over to Havana Harbor, and it blows up. Turns out later that it blew up because of coal dust. So like when you put coal in a furnace, it leaves dust, and the dust hangs in the air invisible. And the more coal, the more dust. The dust is very flammable. So one of my professor's theory is that somebody lit a cigarette and it lit up the coal dust and then blew up the ship. But it was seen as it was viewed to be a attack by the Spanish, terrorist attack. It was never investigated, but McKinley dove into the war at that point. Pretty shady story. Probably was just an accident, but he used it as the excuse to get into war. And I think that was that's a negative for McKinley, I would say, in the sense that it was a Pandora's box of, yeah, we can just fake the reasons we go to war. And so I put the main incident in the same group as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the Vietnam War, the weapons of mass destruction lies that led to Iraq. These are all part of a tradition in the U.S. of fudging the reasons. James K. Polk too, he had his army on the border between Texas and Mexico, and the Mexicans wouldn't fight, even though we declared war. The Mexicans hadn't declared war on us, so we were just standing on the border. And then, or we hadn't declared war yet, sorry. But Polk wanted war. So he had us on the border. And then at some point, some regiment kind of tiptoed into Mexico. So they would do this. They would tiptoe in and out and try to get the Mexicans to shoot at them, so they could say they attacked us. And so basically that's finally one of the Mexican groups couldn't hold their fire any longer, and they attacked the American regiment that was on Mexican soil. But the Americans said that we weren't actually on Mexican soil because they were so close to the border and there were no cameras. And so Pope was like, yep, we got invaded. And that's how they started the war. So I would say that one of the big negatives for McKinley is this, this idea that you can be goaded into a war by a fake crisis, a false flag. And however, he did win the war quickly. So at least there's that. It did. At the end of the war, though, we did get the Philippines, and that did turn into a debacle. So you could argue that goes negative for McKinley as well. This naive idea that we could be the better version of imperialism, that basically it was like, okay, we kicked the Spanish out of the Philippines. They're not organized to govern themselves. Now, what does that mean? I'm not trying to be a white man's burden guy. But the point is like, let's say the Spanish is ruling the Philippines, right? And up above the Philippines, you have Japan. And Japan is becoming a big deal. But they're feeling like kind of small. And they'd like to have more possessions, places like the Philippines. But they're not going to attack the Philippines because they don't want to piss off the Spanish. Once the Spanish are gone, one of the options is to say, let the Filipinos govern themselves. But the rationale not to do that is that now that the threat of Spanish retaliation is gone, the Japanese will go in and take the Philippines. So somebody has to be there to stop that. And so we go and we say to ourselves, we're going to go, but we're not going to colonize them. And to a certain degree, we didn't, but to a certain degree, we did. We're not going to colonize them, but we're going to set up a kind of like free trade regime and invest in them so that they become a self-sustaining country. And then when they're strong enough to protect themselves from other empires, then we'll let them go. Now, one of the reasons why I think that McKinley and his administration were sincere in this naive view that there was such a thing as benevolent imperialism is the open door policy in China, because that was one of the later decisions in the McKinley administration. But after the Spanish left the Philippines and the Japanese were starting to look at the Philippines, we also had this issue of China, which was also on a major decline at the time. And you had, if you've ever been to China, I lived in China for a little while, you have these different European parts of China. So I lived in a city that was part of English territory. And so a lot of the architecture, it's Tianjin, right near Beijing. Tianjin was part of British. And so there's a lot of British stuff there. If you go to Qingdao, which is where they make the beer, it's German. There was all this German stuff there. It was like Germans lived there. If you go to Macau, it was the Portuguese. Even the Italians were trying to get in on the action. Okay? And so all of these empires have just seen the United States take the Philippines. We've got Hawaii now. We've got Guam. We've got a huge Navy, thanks to McKinley investing in the Navy. For the first time, all these empires are like, well, we have to deal with the United States, not just in its immediate neighborhood, but even as far as the Pacific. And so the solution of the McKinley administration is to create this open door policy in which they basically try to set up a system in which nobody gets dominance over China, and everyone has to pay a certain amount of tariffs to China for use of their land. So the idea being that it would be a mutually beneficial agreement. So McKinley and his administration were essentially trying to teach the European empires how to do benevolent imperialism this way through this open door policy. And even the fact that the McKinley administration got Europe to agree to this on itself has to be like considered a victory of presidential leadership for McKinley, although it was John Hay who really was the architect of that. That was his Secretary of State, I think, or War Secretary of State. John Hay, interesting guy. He was Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary during the Civil War. and later a really important diplomat for the United States. Yeah, so China's open door policy that he got everyone, even Russia, agreed to it. All sides recognize each's sphere of influence in China. China can levy tariffs to all, and there will be no discrimination in terms of fees. So you can't, charge the Chinese more for whatever. I don't know. I don't really fully understand what that one is. Sorry. Now, of course, to rain on that parade, not long after the open door policy was implemented, the Boxer Rebellion took place, in which nationalist forces within China attacked and murdered missionaries and all sorts of anyone who was foreign got murdered. Herbert Hoover was in China at that time. Actually, he was a mining engineer, and he remembers seeing, people be murdered at the Boxer Rebellion. So obviously, the open door policy had its bumps along the way, but I don't bring up the open door policy to say that the McKinley administration were masters of benevolent imperialism. I bring it up to show you why they might have believed themselves to be the drivers of this new benevolent form of imperialism that would lead the country into the modern age. And I think there's an argument to say that they succeeded in doing that. That was a form of benevolent imperialism. I can't agree with that completely because, imperialism, it's imperialism, guys. Come on. All right, so I have other stuff I need to do today, but this was a lot of fun. I think I got a lot of ideas out in the stream. I think what I'm going to do is go back and probably watch it and take notes on some of the things I said and try to make them part of the video. If you guys have any other suggestions for me as far as a McKinley video, I was thinking of doing 3 videos. One would be about his election. One would be a comparative video between him and Trump, and then I had maybe another extra idea about is William McKinley or is The Wizard of Oz based on William McKinley, which would be an interesting one to talk about. And finally, one on the idea of assassination culture compared to Leon Czolgosz's murder of McKinley. All right. So I hope that sounds like an interesting little series. And, it's been fun doing this, talking to you tonight. Watch out for those tariffs. They'll get you. And I guess I don't want to say anything preachy in my streams, You get enough of that with the rest of the internet. I don't judge. It's great other people preach, but I'm trying not to preach, which I'm preaching even saying that, aren't I? Anyway, thanks for coming on the stream, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.